Hey boys and girls, welcome to another super exciting, outrageous toy review. I just got done watching The Toys That Made Us, the first 4 episodes of a new Netflix series. It's a limited series, a documentary about 80s action figures. Not exactly 80s action figures, but it felt like it was about 80s action figures. There's an episode about Star Wars toys. There's an episode about Barbie. There's an episode about G.I. Joe. And there's an episode about Masters of the Universe. This series, while being interesting to a toy collector, was definitely made for a general audience. It had a pretty big overview of the historical aspects of the toy companies, the properties that they were coming from, and not a lot of nitty-gritty details about the toys themselves, in the sense that they skimmed over a lot. They didn't show all the characters, or all the figures, or all the waves. It was definitely fun to watch. It was totally interesting. I did like the fact that they showed off and talked to the actual toy designers and the makers. It was not so much of a documentary about fans. It wasn't a tell us about when you were a kid. It was more of like, we were the people that made these toys. And I liked that aspect of it. It was definitely something different, something we haven't always seen in these kind of documentaries. There were some super fans, but these super fans that were in it are people that are experts in that toy line. I also really enjoyed getting to see some of the people that grew up with the brands and are now people creating toys. So guys like Randy Falk from NECA and Brian Flynn from Super 7. These are people that played with these toys, the original toys, and are now making the next generation of those same properties. When it came to the Star Wars episode, I kind of wish they had spent a little bit more time talking about the toys and less about the movies. I understand that without the movies there's no toys, and kind of understanding what was going on with the movie being created and it being an unknown, that they wanted to set that stage. But I kind of feel like, well, maybe not. Maybe if the younger kids wouldn't know. But I feel like most people around for Star Wars knew that it was nothing and then blew up when it hit theaters. But all that time talking about it kind of left the show lacking information about later series of figures. They spent a lot of time talking about the X-Wing, the Millennium Falcon, the TIE Fighter, and those first 12 figures. But then they ended up glossing over Power of the Force, Ewoks, and droids. They did spend a little time talking about the Micro Collection, but pretty much skipped the 12-inch Star Wars figures. There's also a lot of other spaceships in the Star Wars toy line that basically got left out. When it came time to the Barbie episode, I enjoyed them talking about the play patterns and what was significantly different about Barbie from previous toys. I also really enjoyed the fact that they kind of went through a timeline of style and fashion and how Barbie changed with each generation or each decade to improve the toys and make them keep modern, because that's actually a really important thing about longevity in a toy line, is being able to reinvent itself all the time. It's one of the problems that the brands that are tied into media have, like Star Wars. Once the movies are gone, it's dead. A toy line that has no media, like Barbie, has to keep telling its own story. They even mentioned that Barbie could never get married and have kids because then that ends the story. Whereas when she's still just dating Ken, there's this forever story that can be projected on it. And I get that, because as a kid when I played with Star Wars toys, my friends and I had seen all 3 movies because we were born in the early 80s. The story was already done. So we would often create stories about after Return of the Jedi, or we would pretend Return of the Jedi hadn't happened and make up our own alternate Star Wars after Empire. Just because, once they tell you how the story ends, it limits your ability to create those side stories and explore the world with the toys. I thought the section about Barbie's proportions was very interesting. They're explaining how they're using real-world fabrics, and the thickness of that material doesn't actually scale to a Barbie or to a doll, and so the clothing actually kind of fixes the proportions. The proportions need to be smaller, so when the clothing goes on, the bulky clothes make the doll look appropriate. That was weird, something I would have never thought about, but very interesting. And I also really liked them talking about competition like Bratz and Gem. I remember my sister having Stacy dolls back in the 80s, and there were a lot of super generic knockoff Barbie dolls and accessories back then too. And they skimmed over some of those, but they at least hit the most important ones. During the He-Man segment, it was interesting to hear how they had to roll out the comic book and then the cartoon show basically to get the toys sold, and they were just sort of flying by the seat of their pants. Those mini comics and those cartoon shows were a critical part of that toy line and coveted by people to this day. I mean, that's the reason the He-Man lasted. There was a montage during the He-Man segment about other toy lines that were marketed with cartoons that showed off lots and lots of brands, and it made me wish this series was going to be longer. I would love to see an episode about the Kenner Ghostbusters, and the Thundercats, and the Silverhawks, and Jason the Wheeled Warriors, and the list could go on. Similar to the Star Wars section, the He-Man part focused on those original figures. We saw Skeletor and Beastman, Evil Lyn, He-Man, Stratos, quite a bit. But people like Scareglow and Ninjor and King Randor all pretty much got glossed over. I'm glad they included the She-Ra toy line in the Masters segment. I feel like that toy line is a very important part of Masters, and it was interesting to hear them talk about the different play patterns and how eventually the male division blamed She-Ra for the failings of Masters at the end. Although it was brief, I'm glad they included the other versions of He-Man. The other Masters of the Universe toy lines are an important part of the toy line's history. These sections were pretty brief, though. The G.I. Joe segment gave a great history of Hasbro as a toy company, as well as the history of G.I. Joe. It talked about the original 12-inch posable action figures, the Adventure Team, the 3 3/4-inch Real American Hero figures, and even G.I. Joe Extreme. They spent a significant amount of screen time talking about the original Snake Eyes figure, and then never really even acknowledged the fact that there were dozens of versions of him. I know this is kind of a minor complaint, and this feeds into my opinion that this was made more for a general audience than rabid toy collectors, but it did bug me a couple times when they had Joes posed with the wrong accessories in a documentary. You know, there's a level of, like, historicalness and history and fact and research that goes into something like that, more so than just a, you know, like a fan product. So it bugged me a little bit, but it wasn't a huge deal. So I enjoyed the series as a whole. I'm looking forward to the next few episodes getting released. I would love it if they decided to greenlight another round of this, maybe expanding a little more. We got a lot about Hasbro, a lot about Mattel, and a lot about Kenner in this series with the toy lines they picked. It would be pretty neat to see something about LJN, maybe focusing on Thundercats and maybe D&D, or, you know, some of their toy lines. I think they could do more with Kenner if they want to do Mask and Silverhawks, perhaps. I'm sure there's a lot more to tell about Hasbro with other lines they've done, and I'm sure Mattel's got a bunch more things that they could talk about. Maybe Hasbro's partnership with Takara, with Transformers. You know, I don't know. I think the Transformers one's on its way. Are they doing My Little Pony? I'm not even sure what the next few episodes are going to be, but there's a lot of really classic toy lines out there. It's definitely easier to do an episode, a documentary about a toy line that lasted a long time, like G.I. Joe and Transformers. Much more difficult on a short-lived toy line, but I think there's a lot of possibilities. Thanks for watching this super exciting, outrageous toy review. Make sure to check out The Toys That Made Us on Netflix. Like, subscribe, and leave me a comment down below what you thought about this series if you checked it out.